Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the presentation by Dr. Sandra Mathews entitled It's Complicated: A Historical Overview of Pueblo Sovereignty and Land Claims in New Mexico. This is one in the series of Historic Santa Fe Foundation's monthly salons. I'm Melanie McWhorter, the Deputy Director for Historic Santa Fe Foundation. And HSFF is located in Santa Fe, New Mexico on Canyon Road. Currently, we're under construction for our master plan. So if you want to visit, we'd love to have you come by, but we do have some closures during the upcoming months of the offices, the sala, and the gardens. So please visit our website for updates or call or email us to confirm that we're open, including in the garden space. We also post our events, exhibitions, programs at historicsantafe.org and have a really great weekly email that we send out, so you can sign up for that if you'd like to know more about these and other events. And we do have many in-person events as well in Santa Fe and northern New Mexico. A quick announcement for this Zoom experience today. You'll be enjoying this without video or audio. You may have noticed that you don't have that capacity on your end. We ask that you post questions in the chat or the Q&A, whichever is easier for you during the talk. Please post them during. You're welcome to. That kind of gives us a little cue. And after the talk as well, if you think of questions afterwards. We'll try to get to as many as possible. And also please note that we are recording the talk today. So I first engaged with Professor Mathews at the 2023 Historical Society of New Mexico conference, and I was immediately taken with her presence, her depth of research, thoughtful use of language, and her delightful presence. She's a thoughtful communicator and educator in the field of Indigenous history at Nebraska Wesleyan University. Along with Indigenous studies, she teaches courses in U.S. West, environment, Latin American, and pirates, crocheters, and buccaneers. She completed her PhD in U.S. West and Latin American history at UNM. Mathews has published 5 books, 2 award winners, numerous chapters, encyclopedia and dictionary entries, and articles. In fact, our first article about I'm stopped with this one, Sandra. We didn't go about this, and I'm going to try it, and then maybe you have to correct me afterwards. Cruzate grants, thank you, published in New Mexico Historical Review, is one of just 11 articles listed on the New Mexico Supreme Court Law Library Reference Guide for Land Grants website. In addition to her extensive publishing history of 5 books, she has 2 books in the pipeline, which we're very excited about. So if you can all hold your horses till 2026, maybe we'll get to read both of these. One is a New History of New Mexico with Bruce Geltema, if I pronounce Bruce's name right, professor of history at UNM Gallup, and then Pueblo Indian Land and Sovereignty. And this is a 30-year project, of which Sandra calls my magnum opus. So we're very excited about both of those. And of course, the titles will be in the works. So you might just have to follow up with her, and hopefully we'll be publishing some info about that when they're out. Dr. Mathews has done historical consulting for over 30 years, including as an owner-operator of Dancing Loon Historical Consulting, LLC, where she focuses on questions of Indigenous boundary disputes and questions of sovereignty. So we're delighted to have you here today, Dr. Mathews.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm humbled, particularly by our first encounter at Silver City at the New Mexico Historical Society conference. So thank you so much. And I want to say good afternoon and thank you everyone for attending. I am presenting to you from the homelands of the Pawnee, the Omaha, the Oto-Missouri nations, and I honor those who came before me and those who will continue to be stewards of the land long after I'm gone. I'd first like to thank Melanie McWhorter for the invitation to come share my passion for New Mexico history and the important history of Indigenous sovereignty. Second, I would like to thank the Education and Communications Coordinator, Hannah Churchwell, for her superb organization and communication skills that made this presentation a reality. Finally, I would like to welcome all the current viewers and viewers who may find me later on YouTube. Welcome. I look forward to hearing your questions at the end of this presentation. It's complicated. This term, popularized by a movie of the same name from 2009, describes in a nutshell the many layered, nuanced, and deeply intersectional story of Pueblo Indian land grant history in New Mexico. While this presentation could not possibly illuminate the whole story of Pueblo sovereignty and land claims in New Mexico, I hope you will all gain a better understanding of the complicated nature of land tenure. After establishing a rudimentary understanding of Indigenous nations and the relationship to physical homelands, I will explain how those relationships were interpreted by officials in the Spanish and Mexican eras, highlighting some important legal considerations for settled Indigenous communities, and explain how Pueblo Indians attempted to resolve these conflicts over sovereignty and land rights. Finally, I will cover how the new system of land tenure that arrived with the invasion of the United States in 1846 forced Pueblo Indians to create new strategies to defend their legitimate land claims. The presentation will end with recent examples of Pueblo determination that never faded, even into the 21st century and beyond. Through it all, New Mexico Pueblo Indians, as with all Indigenous nations across the United States, have continued to play the long game. Sovereigns and administrations have changed, but their connection to and responsibility for the land have always remained. After all, they have been in New Mexico since time immemorial. Researchers have recently uncovered archaeological evidence of human beings in New Mexico dating from between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago at White Sands. Footprints. This incredible find dramatically changed the story of Indigenous occupation of North America, pushing back scientists' notions of human habitation by 10,000 years. What does this mean for Pueblo sovereignty and land claims? No doubt that will be the topic of future litigation. But in the scheme of Indigenous creation and origin stories, scientific discoveries merely recognize what Pueblo people have said for generations and for centuries. Their people have always lived in New Mexico since time immemorial. To grasp the significance of place for Indigenous nations is impossible without understanding it as an Indigenous person, which many of us cannot do. For their connections are as old as the words of their language. Their stories are written from and onto the landscape. Their historical traditions reach beyond time immemorial. Indigenous peoples had multiple layers of relationships with the natural world, as evidenced by oral tradition, and later codified as historical evidence. These culturally significant relations to physical spaces greatly influence the trajectory of Indigenous land and sovereignty rights across the United States. Not even in the East Coast, however, is the story as complicated as in New Mexico, whose people had to contend with the impact of 3 non-Indigenous sovereigns lasting over 480 years. In the beginning, some Pueblo creation stories inform that ancestors emerged from 4 separate worlds, each world including a series of lessons or calamities. Upon arriving at the present world, small migrations continued throughout their history, not to distant places, as experienced by the Ponca and Omaha of Nebraska, or nations of the Great Iroquois Confederation south of the St. Lawrence River in the east. Rather, they moved among their homelands. According to Elsie Clues Parsons, they often returned to abandoned towns generations later, according to particular patterns, or returned to the sites to venerate them as shrines. Other sacred places existed on the landscapes as well. Alfonso Ortiz described shrines emanating out from the 4 cardinal directions in specific distances in his path-breaking book, The Tewa World. Place had sacred meaning, each locale holding stories that informed or taught or connected the people to place. These places were incorporated into a spiritual structure which logically integrated into daily and spiritual lives. Symbolism and symbols upon their land held stories, their migrations, their spirit world, their clans, their observations of the heavens and seasons, their livelihoods, and even encounters with each other. Described later by outsiders as simple etchings or paintings on stone or cliff faces, these images described 1,000 unsung words and grounded them to place in ways the Spanish and later the Anglo-Americans with their Christian faith would never understand. After all, Pueblos are maintained and remained in their homelands where their creator had put them. Were not the original humans of the Christian story from the Garden of Eden kicked out by their creator? A place their creator made specifically for them? Imagine how indigenous people thought of these proselytizing Spaniards whose very own creator had rejected them, causing them to stray so far from their spiritual homelands. In the eyes of Pueblo people, these interlopers clearly did not have the same symbiotic and spiritual relationship to sacred places like indigenous nations did. Did this rejection from their creator cause some Spaniards to develop a sense of hubris, a sense of superiority that was exhibited by their disrespectful treatment of indigenous peoples, the introduction of new plants and animals and diseases upon the land, and a disregard for Pueblo ceremonies, traditions, and sacred spaces? Even before the arrival of the first Spaniards under Coronado, Spanish incursions into indigenous North America had left a bitter taste. Residents of Hawiku most likely knew of the slave raids to their west and south, orchestrated by the notorious governor of Nueva Galicia, Nuevo Beltrán de Guzmán. Pueblo people personally experienced Spanish violence at Hawiku and at Arenal on the Rio Grande during Coronado's expedition. They saw how the Spanish searched for the yellow metal, so they conspired to lead the Spanish out onto the plains of what is now Kansas, where the Quivirans plotted to kill the Spanish and their horses. Unfortunately for their guide, El Turco, he was garroted before the deed could be done. Nevertheless, the Spanish interlopers left Pueblo homelands in 1542, leaving Pueblos to return to their traditional lives, relatively unmolested. Waylaid by the silver at La Bufa in Zacatecas for over 50 years, the Spanish would not return until 1598. And that time it would be different. Sorry, we have smoke here. Governor and Captain General Juan de Oñate not only brought soldier colonists and their families thousands of head of livestock, new seeds, and the weapons of war, they also brought a new philosophy of conquest, one conditioned by a series of laws that included protections for settled indigenous communities. Due to the reports of violence in the Caribbean after Columbus's second voyage in 1493, royals instituted the laws of Burgos in 1512, which provided guidelines for the behavior of Spanish colonists, particularly in relation to indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. It forbade slavery of indigenous people, endorsed their conversion, but also created the system of encomiendas, which was a system of tribute, items, and labor. Only for 2 years, though. Even though this law removed indigenous people from their homes, in return, Spanish settled them on lands that once given, quote, could not be taken from them, according to the law. Other laws quickly followed, the laws of Valladolid, the Requerimiento of 1513, and the establishment of a protector of the Indians. After having experienced a first-hand violence perpetrated on indigenous peoples in the Caribbean, though, protector of the Indians Bartolomé de las Casas had published his infamous book, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, in 1542, an attempt to curb the power of the Spaniards over indigenous people through the oppressive encomienda system. Up until 1549, encomiendas required both labor and tribute. After 1549, labor could not be demanded, but the power of the encomenderos was hard to check. Conversion was impossible in the face of such brutality, he argued, and as a result, the famous 1550 and 1551 debate in Valladolid, Spain, brought together the greatest minds to argue the theoretical and moral issues related to colonization in the New World. relations between Spanish and Indigenous people, and how the later would be integrated into colonial life. Neither side won, but of course, they both claimed victory. In the end, encomiendas would no longer be willed in perpetuity through the generations, but could only last for 2, maybe 3 generations. And importantly, Las Casas had proven that indigenous peoples could be Christianized. Therefore, they had souls. The subtext? They were human. Incidentally, something the United States did not legally determine until the Standing Bear trial in 1879. More cedulas and edicts and laws followed, so many in fact that by 1681, all laws relating to the Indies were compiled and published as a 3-volume series under the title Recopilación de las Leyes de los Reinos de las Indias, compilation of all the laws relating to the Indies. After 1681, this volume served as a guide for exploration, expansion, settlement, government structure, civil jurisprudence, land ownership, and many others. Spanish officials utilized these volumes as the foundation for indigenous Spanish relations. With Oñate, he brought this very highly heavy legalistic tradition with him as he moved his colonists to the confluence of the Chama and the Rio Grande rivers near Okeowinge. As governor adelantado and captain general, his capitulación, or his contract, allowed him to donate land to settlers not claimed by sedentary indigenous peoples, to grant encomiendas, just for 2 generations now, to protect the colony, to find wealth, to keep his investors satisfied, and to expand the reach of the Catholic crown and church. After Acamá's surprise attack on his men as they traveled west to find a resupply port in 1598, Oñate regrouped for several months before launching a massive retaliatory campaign in January of 1599. In the end, desertions and a lack of ready wealth forced Oñate's hand. He relented, returned to Mexico City, and New Mexico fell to 70 years of church-state conflict, growing paranoia and tensions, demands upon Pueblo Indians for encomienda tribute, severe drought and starvation, and suppression of indigenous spiritual practices. Pueblo Indians responded to this violence, demands, and starvation by rising up in the Great Pueblo Revolt of 1680. They were not passive victims. Any land grants and encomiendas that the Spanish officials may have granted vanished both on land and on paper. That is, all but one set. The infamous Cruzate grants of 1689. Purportedly created when the Spanish were in exile in El Paso from 1680 until 1692, these grants never appeared in the documentary record until the mid-1800s. Based on the testimony of Bartolome de Ojeda, a Zio war captain captured during a fact-finding reconnaissance raid into the heart of Pueblo homelands, these documents delineated the boundaries of 20 New Mexico pueblos. Many questions surround these documents, far more than this presentation has time to cover. But perhaps most simply put, if these Cruzate grants were indeed penned in 1689, why were they never actually delivered by the subsequent governor, Diego de Vargas, when he occupied New Mexico in 1692? As incoming governor, he would have taken charge of the previous governor's archives, and surely he would have seen, mentioned, or distributed the documents to their rightful owners, or at a minimum recorded their existence in his archives, which were extensive and later published by my mentor and dear friend John L. Castle, with the assistance of others such as Rick Hendricks and Robert Martinez, both of whom have become state historians. Robert is still our current state historian. When Vargas arrived in New Mexico, he not only worked to rebuild relations with numerous pueblos by standing in as godfather to the many unbaptized indigenous children. Beginning in 1693, Vargas granted or regranted lands to Spanish settlers in the newly reclaimed region. In other words, Pueblos realized that the Spanish were here to stay. And from 1692 until 1821, encroachment onto Pueblo Indian land increased. They defended their communities as best they could, aided by a variety of advocates, some of which were even local alcaldes. Historians refer to the guarantee of a Pueblo League measured from the center of the church, the center of the community, oftentimes in the four cardinal directions. This set a firm minimum for settled indigenous communities by requiring large livestock to remain at least 1.6 leagues away, and small livestock at least a half a league. Other laws, such as a 1642 cedula, simply stated lands were to be left to Indians, including water and acequias, not alienated from them. Spanish governors made very few grants to indigenous communities in New Mexico, perhaps one of the first being the re-grant 1748 to Sandia Pueblo, encouraging the apostate community to return to the Rio Grande after having located much further west during the 1680s. And the map shows, it doesn't show every single one of the pueblos, but it shows the location, and I'm sure all of you are familiar since you live, probably most of you live in New Mexico, but Sandia actually left and headed far into the west, and the Spanish worked hard to get them to come back to the Rio Grande so that they could be brought back into the fold of the Christian church. While many Pueblo Indians had converted to Catholicism, after the return of the Spanish, they maintained a syncretic spiritual system that intermeshed their traditional religious belief structure with Catholicism on a variety of levels. With less pressure to conform to Spanish norms than during the oppressive missionary era of the 1600s, they allied with the Spanish against real and perceived threats from a variety of nations on the periphery, including some Apache and Navajo, and some newly arrived Comanche, their formidable neighbors to the east. These Spanish allies, however, continued to harbor hubris and encroach upon Pueblo lands, sometimes accidentally by livestock wonder, some through overlapping claims, but also through purposeful and outright taking. Nevertheless, Pueblo Indians had learned to utilize the Spanish language and laws to defend against encroachment by registering complaints while walking boundary surveys to the local alcaldes, to the governor, to the Mexico authorities in Mexico City. In fact, Sandia had a permanent defender on retainer in Mexico City to defend their claims. The Mexican period challenged land tenure in new ways, mostly due to the onslaught of Anglo-Americans along the Santa Fe Trail beginning in 1821. Governor Manuel Armijo, whose family had made their fortune in the Rio Grande in the sheep and trading industry, was deeply engaged in political and economic power. He is famous for having granted more than half of all land grants ever granted in the history of the region between 1821 and 1846, including land grants to Mexicans in partnership with Anglo-Americans. These partnerships facilitated acquisition of Mexican citizenship necessary for legal trapping and trading, but also exempted them from ever-tightening restrictions on foreigners in the 1840s. The best lands along the Rio Grande and its tributaries were already occupied, some for centuries. Therefore, many of the newer grantees ended up on the periphery of original Spanish and Pueblo settlement zones, similar to Genízaro communities. In some cases, abandoned grants found their way into the hands of new individuals during the Mexican period, such as San Cristobal and Pecos. Many Pueblos who lived near Spanish and Mexican land grants found their boundaries dwindling. They attempted to assert themselves where possible with protestations to the authorities, but Pueblo authority had weakened significantly as their populations dropped. Furthermore, the balance of power had shifted with the increasing number of Anglo-Americans, first as trapper or traders, later marrying into local Hispano families, a portent of things to come. Encroachment by non-Indians on Pueblo Indian land became commonplace, reaching a fevered pitch by the 1840s. Following the occupation of Stephen Watts Kearny in 1846, a new system of laws arrived to regulate land tenure. Based on the grid system first established in the eastern Ohio under the Land Ordinance of 1785, the United States survey system disregarded logical geographical partitions. Left in charge of the newly acquired region, Governor Charles Bent would not have time to assert his authority. In fact, many pueblos, in concert with local Hispanos, rose up in revolt. Bent's assassination of January of 1847 left Lieutenant Governor Donaciano Vigil in charge. Vigil had incredible knowledge of Spanish and Mexican legal systems, land grants, and what treasures the archives held. He was a longtime public servant and territorial secretary during the Mexican era, and soon to be ex officio governor for New Mexico. He was also the first registrar of land documents. Vigil had served under Governor Armijo when Armijo had penned that immense number of land grants, giving Vigil intimate knowledge of the locations of existing grants, as well as abandoned or nearly abandoned grants. In this position, he created a list of all land grant documents existing in the archives of the 1840s. He was intimately knowledgeable about land ownership through the region, and importantly, he understood Spanish and legal precedent. He was indispensable to the new authorities in bridging understanding as a land grant expert and translator as the transition to U.S. authority began. The uncertainty of this shift in political authority created an untenable situation in Pueblo homelands. Between encroachments by Mexicans, the fear of future encroachments by Anglo-Americans, and perhaps emboldened by the recent murder of Charles Bent, the unease of the southern Pueblo is beginning to be felt by many. Vigil started receiving reports from local leaders such as Francisco Saraceno of the Rio Bajo, who in 1847 reported a strong likelihood of an uprising of Isleta, Laguna, and Acoma pueblos. More dispatches arriving informed Vigil that other alcaldes also feared that they would be assassinated by Pueblo Indians. Whether real or imagined, these fears drove passions to run high. Documentary evidence illustrates tensions permeating New Mexico during this time period of transition. U.S. officials like James S. Calhoun, the first Indian agent and superintendent of Indian Affairs in New Mexico, as well as the first civil and military governor, James Monroe, attempted to assure Pueblos that their internal political power would not be usurped, nor would their land be taken. They had both heard extensive reports from Pueblos about unscrupulous individuals circulating among them, as well as the Apaches and Navajos. On June 25th of 1850, the men co-authored a letter to the leaders of the Pueblos warning them that, quote, malicious representations have been made to you, end quote, and continued to ensure them that they were safe in the possessions of their home, property, lands, and could continue to govern themselves. Superintendent of Indian Affairs James S. Calhoun wrote in 1850 that, quote, Pueblo Indians have besieged the superintendency, end quote. In a 3-day council, the Pueblos of Sandia, Santa Ana, San Felipe, Zia, Santo Domingo, Cochiti, San Ildefonso, Santa Clara, Tesuque, Nambe, and Taos sent in delegations, all highly excited about the continued encroachment and threats to their land. At the end of their delegation, he reported that, quote, conclusion was drawn up by the governor of Sandia, an exceedingly clever Indian, end quote, that they refused to give up on their ways, that the U.S. needed to treat them with respect, or, quote, blood would spill, end quote. The ultimatum was not lost on Calhoun, and he grew more passionate in his letters to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Some malicious people circulating among Pueblos were identified as merchants who traveled freely, selling arms and munitions. They spread rumors that the U.S. could not hold on to the possession, and that over 25,000 Mexican troops were at the border. If the U.S. did win, it would take all the Indians' lands and kill them all. Calhoun found it imperative to keep lines of communication open with the Pueblos. He continued to report extensively to the commissioner, declaring that the Pueblos were, quote, a valuable and available people. Their lands are held by Spanish and Mexican grants. To what extent is unknown, end quote. Calhoun estimated the population was about 12,000 to 15,000 Pueblo Indians. But Indian agent John Griner's count, as reported March 25, 1852, seemed a lot more sparse. The numbers indicated the great losses that Pueblo populations had suffered. He reported that Taos had 500 to 600, Picaris had 100, and in a few years, quote, they'll cease to exist as a people, end quote. Clearly not true. Santa Clara, 350 people. San Ildefonso, 200 to 250 and decreasing. Pojoaque, 48 people only, quote, due to being crowded out by Mexicans. In a few years will cease to be recognized as a pueblo, end quote. Nambe, which seemed to be doing fine. Tesuque, 250. And then Pecos ruins. They were forced out when Mexicans took over their homes and fields, quote, 7 years ago, reduced to 4 families and moved to Jemez, end quote. The first U.S. Surveyor General, William Pelham, arrived in New Mexico in 1854, and he appeared to care about protecting Pueblo land rights, ushering their claims through the system quickly in order to have them confirmed and patented to provide full legal protections against encroachment from subversive characters. He was assisted in his collection, translation, cataloging, recording, and investigating land claims by Chief Clerk Alexander P. Wilbar, and none other than Donaciano Vigil. Considered a legal expert as a result of Vigil's knowledge of the previous legal system, G. Emlyn Hall wrote that, quote, American officials would say what he liked, depended simply on land documents previously certified by Donaciano Vigil as Armijo's secretary or Kearny's Register of Land Titles, end quote. Perhaps their trust was misplaced. After all, Vigil had acquired a portion of the abandoned Pueblo of Pecos, and Pueblos felt the pressure of the new Anglo-Americans who saw land as merely a commodity. Pueblos understand that they would fare better in the new system if they had documents to prove their legitimate ownership under the new system. Customary law might not be enough. So when 3 merchants arrived in the 1840s and early 1850 among the Acoma, Laguna, and Sandia and other pueblos to peddle what they claimed to be original land grant documents dated 1689, it should not come as a surprise that most eagerly acquired the papers to show the new government that they indeed held proper title to their lands. All but Acoma, that is. Acoma instead took the merchants to territorial court to demand that the documents be surrendered without purchase, because the grants clearly belonged to them. The case itself reveals determination of Acoma to demand their rights to land, as well as it revealed the muddy origins of the documents and forms the core of my upcoming book. In a nutshell, purportedly an illiterate man from northern Mexico acquired the documents from his father, who was an avid reader, a military officer, and a collector of books. And somehow this man chose to bring these particular documents to New Mexico when he moved here in the 1830s. Interestingly, the trial reveals that several of these Cruzate grants went through a variety of hands before arriving at the Pueblos, including Francisco Saraceno and Manuel Armijo. During the trial, however, the issue at hand was not their validity, but their provenance and ownership. The merchant was told to deliver the documents to Acoma without recompense. These Cruzate grants began showing up in William Pelham's office as legitimate proof of ownership in 1854. Sandia, the one that had the clever governor, did not even turn in or mention the 1689 grant, but rather utilized the 1748 grant that they had received as documentary proof instead. With or without a Cruzate grant or any other land grant, Pueblos also swore lengthy oral testimony that they had held their land since time immemorial. It was upon these documents and testimony that Pello ordered surveys to conducted to measure and mark the boundaries on maps for confirmation in Congress. All of the original documents ended up in Washington, D.C., and while they were eventually returned to New Mexico, They remained in the archive. They were not returned to the Pueblos. Once confirmed, the grants became permanently fixed on paper. And unlike the majority of indigenous nations under U.S. authority, Pueblos were allowed to remain on their homelands, albeit much reduced due to 100 years of foreign occupation. Other tribes had fought the United States, negotiated, and eventually yielded to U.S. authority, either forced to move to distant lands or, if they were lucky enough, also massively reduced reservations in their homelands. But confirmation of Pueblo land grants in the 1860s did not end encroachment. In fact, by 1891, the Court of Claims concluded an investigation that found the Cruzate grants were forgeries, throwing the whole question of Pueblo land ownership into uncertainty again. William Tipton pointed out several irregularities. The Secretary of Government and War that signed the documents didn't exist. There was no Pedro Ladrón de Guitarra, thief of guitars. He argued that Laguna Pueblo didn't even exist until 1699. He said that Santo Domingo Pueblo's grant was an exact replica of phrasing that came from Antonio Barrero's book, Ojeada sobre Nuevo Mexico, which was published in 1832. If the documents were penned and utilized in the colonial era, would they not have been referred to as the Gironza grants anyway, and not the Cruzate grants, a common error by non-Spanish speakers? He pointed out that the formatting of the initial portion of the grant is incorrect. If you've read Spanish documents, you know that they all start off the very same way, but there were several grants that did not do that. And here's the kicker. This is something that has been uncovered in more recent research. Most of the documents are written on paper that bears this watermark. The Mariano on one side with a flourish, M flourish on the other. These were 14 by 8 sheets, 8 by 14, yeah, 8 by 14 sheets of paper that were doubled over, so they were sewn down the middle. This paper was never utilized until the 19th century. It's never been found in the archive before the 19th century. There is no document that is written on until 1830. In fact, many of the documents that have Mariano watermarks were penned by men in the circles of Donaciano Vigil and Manuel Armijo, such as people like Francisco Saraceno in 1840. Some of the unused papers were later utilized by Surveyor General Clark in his office as late as 1862. So clearly the Mariano paper was utilized first in the 1830s. The last we can find is 1862. As a side note, a former state historian, Richard Salazar, sent the documents for testing to determine the age of the paper and ink. They reveal a much later origin than 1689. Clearly, the documents were spurious. By the time Tipton had made his judgment about the nature of these so-called Cruzate grants, the 19th century had arrived. By then, the tenor of the westward expansion had changed. The frontier no longer existed according to the 1890 census. There was no room for uncivilized people to exist separately from mainstream civilization. The master narrative dominated and would continue for over 100 years. How could Pueblos press their claims under an oppressive regime that stole their children, forced them to live far away at education concentration camps, boarding schools, disallowed their language, outlawed their spiritual practices and ceremonies, stole their annuities, forced them to adopt to white man's ways? Some sold off their land under the Dawes Act of 1887, changed their governmental structure under the Wheeler-Howard Act and the Indian New Deal of the 1930s, forced them to give up land claims under the Indian Claims Commission, which promised compensation, not land back, of the 1940s, and then threatened to terminate them altogether under the Termination and Relocation Act of the 1950s. Patience. Pueblo Indians had to play the long game. Sandia Pueblo, who refused to turn in their Cruzate grant to Pelham in the 1850s, is a prime example. When the U.S. opened the door for tribes to file claims against the U.S. for illegal taking of lands in 1946, Sandia chose not to file claims. Just like the Lakota, who actually did file claims for their sacred Black Hills, stolen from them thanks to the likes of George Armstrong Custer and a lust for gold, they did not want compensation. They wanted their land back. The erroneous survey completed and confirmed in 1860 excluded the entire western slope of the Sandia Mountains. So they waited until the administration and the climate of U.S. Indian relations shifted, hoping for an opening. In 1980, when several mining applications were filed for the mountain, they petitioned the U.S. Solicitor's Office to press their claim. For nearly 18 years, tense conversations continued. When in 1998, a U.S. District Court judge agreed that the original grant from 1748 boundary extended to the crest of the Sandias, immediately Republican Senator Pete Domenici and Representative Heather Wilson wrote the Attorney General Janet Reno, urging the Justice Department to appeal the judge's decision. After all, they argued, the area included Sandia Peak Tramway, hiking trails, inn holders, Cibolo National Forest, all key to tourism and public use. Ultimately, similar to the return of Taos Blue Lake in 1972 by Richard Nixon, and the return of over 25,000 acres to Cochiti in 1983, Sandia celebrated the return of the Sandia Mountain with the Tough Sur Bien, probably said that wrong, Preservation Trust Area Act in 2002. Perhaps this laid the foundation for future actions as well. In 2016, Cochiti Pueblo received from the New Mexico State Trust lands over 9,000 acres of the Cañada de Cochiti land grant in exchange for property they purchased for $8 million in Santa Fe. In the end, Pueblo Indians watched, adapted, adjusted, and learned from the numerous sovereigns who had come into their homelands to claim dominion over their peoples. They demanded justice by exhibiting strength and military might through the Pueblo revolts, smaller revolts, and threats of revolts, and dogged determination by learning Spanish and then English, learning new legal systems, utilizing and appreciating the assistance of advocates, and they persistently pressed their claims in Spanish and then Mexican legal structures locally, regionally, in Mexico City, and even to the court in Spain. They continued to demand justice under the U.S. by besieging the Superintendent of Indian Affairs, providing extensive testimony and documents to Surveyor General, and again to the Court of Claims in the late 19th century, and again in 1920s to the Pueblo Lands Board, and again to the Indian Claims Commission, or later to the U.S. Solicitor's Office, and now even through social media with the recent hashtag #LandBack. Pueblo Indians, as all Indian people, remain. They have not disappeared, and their voices are becoming stronger. The U.S. can no longer hide its story of dispossession, attempted eradication, and outright theft. A new narrative must be inclusive, honest, and multi-layered. It's complicated. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Sandra. That was packed with a lot of information. I'm incredibly impressed. That's a lot of research. So if there's any questions, please post in the chat or the Q&A, either place that you would like to post them. So you talk a little bit about the current state, but are there other kind of current claims to land that are pending now, especially in New Mexico?
Yes. Most of what happens when it comes to the land claims are not published. They're not publicized. In part because of what happened with Sandia. If the original claim started with the U.S. Solicitor's Office in 1980 after Nixon came in, and with the return of Taos Blue Lake, kind of created a little bit of an opening The very first decision was for the Pueblo to have access to the mountain, but then there was this uprising and sort of a bit of a furor, and inholders and other people of interest that didn't want the Pueblo to take over. There's this almost a fear campaign, understandably, because this was a big deal. I mean, I lived in Albuquerque for 10 years, and to imagine not having access to La Luz Trail, for example, was a scary thing. And I have friends that were inholders. Nobody knew if that meant that they were going to have to give their homes up and move. But the Pueblo had to continuously fight against that, the misinformation campaign that no, we're not going to make you move out, and no, we're not going to close down the tram, no, we're not going to move, close down La Luz. And so the decision was reversed, and then in 1998 it was reversed again. And so they finally understood that they needed to come to an understanding together of what needed to happen. So a lot of what we're seeing now is exchanges, in part thanks to the casinos and other money-making ventures. The tribes finally have finances that they can acquire property that is desirable to perhaps other people that own property that used to belong to the Pueblo. So San Felipe did a lands transfer. Cochiti is just, of course, did the lands transfer for the old Dixon Apple Farm. That was the old cañada there. There are continued conflicts with that because the maintenance of the road, I think it's called the old Dome Road that goes through Cañada de Cochiti and then all the way up to the caldera is impassable. And so the people that actually were inholders up the road can't access that land. And so there's a big conflict happening right there currently. So yes, there are definitely issues there. The last I heard with Acoma is that this one isn't land, but it's over water, fight over water with a fracking company. So, and of course, fracking is a deal, and access to water comes with access to land.
Yeah. I have some other questions, but we do have a question that popped up. So let's take one from Tim Sweeney. Said, is it possible that the land grant documents found to be forged were handwritten copies of valid original land grant documents?
That's oftentimes what people have argued. In fact, Charles Cutter and Iris Engstrand made that argument many years ago. And it's usually countered with, if you're familiar with with any Spanish documents, if there is, and there were always copies made of everything, because anytime something was collected or recorded in Santa Fe, it was kept in a local archive, sent to the Viceroy's office in Mexico City, a second copy, and a third copy would end up in Sevilla in the Spanish archives. And so theoretically, if that were the case, there would be more copies in those archives because they were always made in triplicate. But most importantly, it always specified on the bottom of the document, and maybe I can bring up the document here, right above the A, right in these A areas. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but after all the last of the signatures, there would be the scribe would say, this is a true and valid copy of an original document that I made on such and such a date, and the person would sign it. And that doesn't exist. So, but also the question about whether or not, okay, well, if they were copies, then why did nobody ever mention them anywhere for, almost 150 years until the middle of, right before the United States comes and requires land documents. But yeah, something would have popped up somewhere. Now, the other side of that too is nobody's ever found Cruzate's archive. He joined what was called the Compañía Volante, the flying company, for lack of better words. and was around the Arispe area. And people have looked in those archives. They've looked in the archives in Durango and they found nothing. So, I mean, miracles can happen, but the problem is, even so, if Antonio de Barrero had in fact copied his phrase out of one of these documents and put it in his book, because of course the language is literally, there's an entire paragraph that's straight out of his book. He should have mentioned the documents himself, or they would have been known if he knew about them. But nobody mentioned them even in the 1830s. So most of the evidence points to the fact that they are, in fact, they were fabricated much, much later. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you for asking.
And then I may have missed this during the course of the talk, but how did they discover the forgeries in the first place? Why
Oh,
did
yeah, so if you look at Cruzati's signature, which is Domingo Gironza Patricio Cruzate, it doesn't look like his original signatures. There are enough of his original signatures on other documents that weren't part of his archive that
okay.
when compared, you can clearly see that they aren't the same.
Okay, that was one of the very first flags that kind of raised it about the document.
Very, very, yes, absolutely. And
Okay.
then, of course, this Pedro ante me, before me, Don Pedro Ladrón de Guitarra didn't exist. Secretario de Guerra de, yeah, so the secretary.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So there was no such person. There was somebody that had a name similar, but it wasn't Ladrón de Guitarra.
And let's see. And if anyone else has any more questions, I do have one more, but then there's Tim followed up. He said watermark of the 19th century paper was key in demonstrating the forgery. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. And researchers have gone all the way to Italy, through Mexico. I think Rick Hendricks was looking through Mexico. I've been following up a lead. The watermark is almost exact typeface as a watermark out of Kansas City. And interestingly, David Whiting, who was one of the translators of the land grants that recorded them in the land grant book, is from Kansas City. And the Whiting paper has a white, the watermark says Whiting on it. And so one of my interest areas is to go to the Kansas City area and see if I can't track down that typeface that would have made that imprint, see where that was made, and see if I can make a connection to maybe another location that would maybe help me track down where the Mariano paper was made. But in all, the best case scenario is probably either made in Italy, Spain, or Mexico. Highly doubt Mexico, but even the type of paper does not match the type of paper that was used 140 years earlier, 150 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Great question.
So anyone else has any more questions, please post those. I wanted to just follow up too, because I thought that was interesting that you mentioned that Cochiti traded. And then you also, in the follow-up question that kind of came up about that's a common practice nowadays. So was it something that the Pueblo possessed for a while, or you said they bought it because they actually had funds? And then that's the common practice nowadays. If they're going to trade, they want something in return.
Maybe I misspoke by saying common practice. It's when San Felipe was involved in a trade with and I think it was it was either BLM or Forest Service. They had acquired some land that they then traded with this federal governmental entity so that they could have one of their sacred areas returned. This was, oh my gosh, I want to say maybe the 1980s or 90s. I'd have to go look that up. The Cochiti, the very first land return that they got was by legislative action. So there's actually a an act that allowed for the return of that land in 1983. Taos, I believe, was executive order. And so there are a few ways. Now, once you once you acquire land, it doesn't mean it's part of the federal trust. And so technically it could still be taxed until it's put in the federal trust. And so that's the next step. And I believe, I may be wrong on this one, but I believe that Cochiti is in process to have the land put in the federal trust so that it would be considered part of the quote unquote reservation. And that's part of the holdup for the closing of the road. I don't know that it's common practice, but it is one manner in which you can get land returned to you. Another way is one of my friends who is an inn holder on Sandia Mountain said that when they decided to no longer have their house, they were going to will it to the Pueblo. And that's actually happens all over the United States. So we have a folklorist here in Nebraska that recently passed away, and his family owned farmland. And when his parents died, they gave it to the Pawnee tribe.
Hmm.
So that's actually something that's starting to happen as well.
Hmm. Well, great, Sandra. I don't know if there's any more questions. Everybody's being shy in the background now. So if do you have a website?
Yes, I do. Thank you for asking. Let me put up my last slide. If anybody has questions and they don't feel like asking them here, or if you are interested in, maybe reading what some of my resources were, just pop me an email at Mathews.historian@gmail.com. You can also look at my LinkedIn page. Just do a search for Sandra Mathews. You can also just do a search for me at Nebraska Wesleyan University. Our search engine isn't the greatest, but you can just email me and that'll be perfectly fine. I understand that this will be available online later via
Yes.
YouTube, so you can snatch this later if you haven't done a screen grab already.
Yes, or we can get it from you too and share it on our end if anybody wants to email the wonderful Hannah, who you were referencing earlier. Many of you received communications with her. So, well, fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sandra. It was really great to see you here. And well, before we go, I don't know if there's another comment, but you just had a Dr. Mathews, excellent information. Thank you. Just one last comment.
Oh.
So yes, thank you very much for the presentation. And I hope we'll be seeing you in Santa Fe soon, maybe with the Historical Conference, Historical Society of New Mexico Conference in Albuquerque next year. So look for that, everyone.
Yeah. So if you're in New Mexico, every spring, the Historical Society of New Mexico holds a conference, and it's very close next year. Last year, we got to meet each other in Silver City, but next year it's going to be in Albuquerque. So you just hop down the road and I will be there. And I think I'm convincing the Historic Santa Fe Foundation to hopefully come as well. And so you can learn about all sorts of different kinds of historical topics. There's a book fair that happens, book dealers, and lots of historical societies show up, and you can learn a lot more about our state in that place. So
very affordable and a great series of talks. So, all right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Mathews, Professor Mathews. We will see you soon. All right. Thanks everyone for attending. Have a good evening.